Hey everybody, sorry about the delay in posting this. We had a bunch of thunderstorms here in Atlanta and I lost power yesterday, so it made it a little harder to do this technology thing. Okay, but now we're moving on to chapter 8 in our book, and we're looking at coordination, subordination, and ellipsis. And so we're going back to what we were looking at in an earlier chapter on clauses. And this, I think, is such critical stuff. It can feel a little overwhelming, but don't worry, you'll get it. So let's talk about coordination. And these, this is what sometimes people talk about fanboys, but really the most common ones are and, but, and or. Uh, so bed and breakfast, for richer or for poorer. I'm soaking wet, and you think that's funny. Um, Subordination is where you have a dependent clause embedded as part of the main clause, or a dependent clause embedded into the main clause, which is also called the independent clause in some grammar books. Um, he was screaming because he had to go home. He was screaming is our main sentence, but then you've got that subordinate clause or dependent clause because he had to go home. So, and then the third part of clausal material that we're going to look at this week is ellipsis. And that's where elements have been removed from the text, but they're there in meaning. So he squeezed her hand but met with no response. That he is part of what's supposed to be in there, but we don't need to have it. Perhaps as the review gathers steam, this can now change. It needs to. And what's implied there is it needs to change. And it's a really interesting thing in this chapter, how they look at ellipsis. And that's something that for students is very hard, because especially if they become aware of it and then they try to use it in places where it can't be used. So let's look at independent clauses. The major types, we have declarative clauses, which have a subject-verb structure, and they express statements. Interrogative clauses, which are questions. Exclamative clauses for exclamations, and then orders or imperative clauses. I want to take a look here at finite versus non-finite clauses. And we're going to look at that primarily with dependent clauses because the non-finite are almost never going to be independent clauses. The term finite means finished or limited. And so what it means is that you can have it be first, second, third person. You can have a tense. You can also have modals for finite clauses. And that's sort of what we think of when we think about verb. So you can drink your orange if you like. I don't like that guy that she's dating. I don't like the guy she is dating. All of those that are marked there are finite clauses. Now the other part of each one of those sentences is also a finite clause, but we're looking at these in the dependent clause group. Okay. Finite dependent clauses will often have an overt link, such as that or if. And oftentimes they can be, when it's a dependent clause, sometimes that can be omitted. That's part of the ellipsis. Non-finite clauses, and this gets a little trickier. Non-finite clauses have no tense, and they can't have modals. And oftentimes there's not a vocabulary word that is linking them, like an if or a WH word. But because it's in the non-finite verb form, that shows that it's a subordinate clause or dependent clause. Leaving the road, they went into the deep darkness of the trees. Now, because we, and soon enough our students will know that leaving the road is not a complete sentence, we know that that has to be subordinate to something, to a main clause. One of the types of non-finite clauses are what they call to clauses, and that it has the to plus the infinitive verb, and sometimes people just call that the infinitive use of the verb. I would like to go to the zoo with you. I would like Susan to go to the zoo with you. And notice that both of those things are sort of acting almost like an object in the sentence. I would like pizza. I would like to go to the zoo with you. Another non-finite clause are the ing clauses. Also, sometimes they're called gerunds, but we're calling them ing clauses. They start with the verb in the ing form, and it's generally not going to have a second subject in there. But the subject of that non-finite clause is implied. I suggested buying a larger office space. That doesn't mean that they're suggesting that I buy it necessarily. It could be based on what the context is, someone else, or a group, or who knows. And then it can be more specific, where you say, I suggested his buying a larger office space. That's not nearly as common. And typically, if that is what for example, if your student is trying to write something like that, oftentimes you may direct them using a strategy where they rewrite it and make it a finite clause. I suggested that he buy a larger office space. So, another non-finite clause are ed clauses, and that's a little bit misleading because it's really the past participle. So most of them are going to be eds, but it can be things like eaten, hidden. And so it says, I gave him the memo received last night. And what was implied is that there's that passive voice component, the memo that was received last night. And this is a very common construction, but it can be confusing for students. And then finally, we have what are called the bare infinitive clauses. And that's where you just say, I helped clean the house. I helped Susan collect her possessions. And sometimes some grammar books or other ESL materials are going to note that the use of this is sometimes dependent on the verb that's in front of it. And also, for example, in these things you can say, I helped to clean the house. So lots of things for students to be thinking about, and for us as teachers as well. Okay, I just want to mention one thing before I close, and that is, please make sure that you're trying at least some of those activities in our workbook. You may find if you're doing a couple of them and you're saying, okay, I think I got this, you check the answers in the back, you say, yep, those are good. You don't have to go through and do them all, because some of these, there are quite a few exercises. But if you're trying them and you're really not getting them, please mention something in our discussion board. You can put one up there as an example and ask one of your classmates or me to look at it and see what we can come up with. Also, I want to just mention I've started posting some little online, like self-quiz type things where you can go in and look at some terminology as well as look at some of the examples that we had in our discussion board in past weeks, so you can see how those things really should be identified, and compare them to what you have. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you soon.